Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Embracing the Energy Transition. I am joined here today by two amazing panelists who are going to share some really interesting and deep insights around the energy transition, what this looks like, what are some real barriers that we can actually view as levers of how to achieve this very, very ambitious goal. So with that, let us welcome our panelists. So I'm Alyssa Rade. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain.Life. To those of you who don't know Sustain.Life, we are a carbon accounting and ESG SaaS platform, and we help businesses measure their carbon emissions, translate their business activities in those emissions outputs, and also help with their ESG programs and reporting so that you can build sustainability programs, operationalize these initiatives, and then talk about them in the language and metrics that stakeholders, whether that's your employees or your customers or your shareholders, what they need to evaluate and assess and understand how you're performing as a business in the sustainability space. So I'm joined here today by two great panelists. I will give a brief introduction and then ask them each to introduce themselves. I get the pleasure of reading the little bio blurbs. So we are joined today by Lauren Kraft. She is the editor at Energy Intelligence, where Lauren leads the global team of journalists that cover the energy transition. She oversees coverage on everything from technology to corporate strategy, investor scrutiny to policy, transportation to power. Lauren has shared the EI New Energy team's insights on media broadcasts and conferences such as New York Climate Week. And she has special interest in highlighting constructive solutions of the energy transition, including technologies that can be deployed in the hard to abate sectors like oil and gas, transport, and heavy industry. So welcome, Lauren. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll introduce, and then we can vote.
It's so glad to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Okay, and then our other panelists, we are joined here by Luke Falk. He is the COO of Clean Path New York and SVP of Energy RE. And in that capacity, he is responsible for the development of Clean Path New York. If you don't know about it, you're going to learn about it. It is an incredible generation and transmission project in New York State. Energy RE is an independent New York company focused on solving complex challenges, providing clean energy solutions. And the team at Energy RE has expertise in infrastructure, engineering, and real estate. So welcome, Luke, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. All right. Well, before we kick it off into the agenda, why don't you both Luke, we'll kick it off with you. I see you're off mute already. Just say hi to everybody and let them know, what your experience is in the space and the perspective that you hope to bring to this webinar on embracing the energy transition.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me on the platform to help amplify the message of what we're trying to do with Clean Path and through Energy RE broadly. Energy RE is a relatively young, new company in the clean energy development space. We focus on an approach to decarbonizing urban centers through what we call a transmission-led generation approach to conceiving of big, complicated clean energy projects. And, we'll dig into a little bit about how that's made manifest through Clean Path. But in addition to that, we have verticals working on offshore wind projects, as well as distributed generation, storage and EV charging and commercial real estate, as well as wind and solar sort of terrestrial greenfield ground up development across 17 states. We knew each other from a previous life, Alyssa, where, I used to work at a company called the Related Companies, which is a large real estate development firm. And before that, I worked for the state of New York, helping to run their clean energy programs in the multifamily sector. So thanks for having me. I've been trying to dig into the energy transition for a long while at this point. I'm glad to be continuing along that path.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, it is wonderful to see you again because yes, we do go way back. Lauren, you want to just share a little bit your perspective?
Yeah, I am like Alyssa mentioned, I'm the editor of EI New Energy, and we cover the global energy transition, and we like to offer solutions rather than just talking about doom and gloom. And yes, we have problems, but what are the solutions to those problems and what are the opportunities therein? And some big picture comments that I'd like to bring to the discussion is let's focus on opportunities. Let's focus on not looking at the energy transition in a vacuum, but ways that the energy transition can match up with economic stability and it can match up with political stability. In that vein, never putting all our eggs in one basket. Competition is a good thing, and having a diverse range of options, whether it's different technologies or relying on different geographies, that's always a healthy thing to do.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Um, so I've got our agenda here. So you can likely tell from who we've got on the line today, what we want to do is not just talk about what is the global energy transition, what are the obstacles and the big, heavy hill that we have to climb in front of us, but we'll talk about the current state. Let's talk about the goals, where we're trying to go on the global perspective, as well as, more domestically in the US, and then even as a more regional example, New York State. And then let's talk about the barriers. But, for the audience and everyone on the line, when we were putting together the agenda and all the talking points for this session, what we really gravitated towards was not just the barriers, but as Lauren said, being able to identify this is the landscape, these are the challenges, these are the barriers, but there are really levers that we can pull to take advantage and actually try to achieve this transition. This is the playing field. So let's play on the board with the pieces we have and make the best use of those opportunities. So we'll have a discussion on really some of the breakthrough solutions in the space. A little bit of Q&A before I forget. Please use the Q&A feature for any questions. We have saved some time at the back end of this so that we will get to all of your questions. And this is recorded, so you'll receive a recording after this. So in case you have to drop off or just want to have this in perpetuity for your listening pleasure. So let's kick it off. Let's just talk broad strokes, like where we are in the current state. So, Lauren, maybe you could provide like a bit of a brief overview just to help the audience understand what is the current global energy landscape before we dive into the granular details, like where are we starting today?
Mm. Well, in terms of the energy transition, I would say that it's moving along, but there are some distractions. I remember when I was at COP27 this past fall in Egypt, there was some progress made, but there was a lot of frustration that things could be going faster if there wasn't so much going on in the world. And really, we need to get to a point where we realize that there's always going to be something going on in the world. But there's been a lot the past few years, and these factors have influenced the energy conversation. So one key example, the first one there is energy security. And we've seen this with the Russia-Ukraine war, and Europe in particular, and other places have been trying to wean themselves off of Russian gas in particular and Russian energy. And they realized, hey, we were relying too much on a country that maybe we shouldn't have been relying on, or maybe we should have been more diversified. And so, we say here these are competing priorities, but in a way they can also be reinforcing priorities. So in some ways, the focus on energy security has created a detriment to energy transition. So, for example, governments are hesitant to pass any new policies, even if they've been under discussion, that could potentially increase costs on consumers more. Um, that's already an issue. But at the same time, you've seen places like Europe, they've wanted to expand in renewables because they've seen the problems. They want to rely less on fossil fuels. So really the geopolitical issues we've seen have reinforced. In the US, we've seen a much, much greater emphasis on becoming more supply chain independent. And, in things like batteries, we see so much reliance on China, especially for the processing of minerals for battery production, but also manufacturing of many other equipment that is used in the power sector, just across the energy transition landscape. And so that's probably healthy, regardless of one's political views, regardless of where one sits in the world. It is healthy to promote a diversified supply chain because we need to be prepared for everything. So, what can be a distraction can also be a reinforcer. It can be kind of that push or, that kick to do something that really in the long run will make a difference. We also live in a world of ironies. And just this past week, we saw China we see both the distraction and the reinforcer here. We've seen China ask its oil and gas companies, they have state oil and gas companies, to continue to ramp up oil and gas production. And we're seeing this attitude both among energy companies and among countries that they want to focus on all of the above. They don't want to get stuck in a place where we don't have enough supply or we're too dependent on one country for supply. So there's been a greater focus on all of the above, whether that's renewables, just more renewables, more fossil fuels, just make sure we have plenty. So they're asking their oil and gas producers, there's three main ones that are state run in China, to, continue to crank out that oil and gas. But at the same time, they're also asking them to increase their decarbonization efforts, cleaning up their operations so that it's lower emission. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. So we're in a world of overlapping priorities, sometimes competing priorities, but at the same time reinforcing priorities, and then some ironies thrown in there. With regard to supply chain security, I touched on this a little bit, but we've seen with lots of equipment get delayed. And sometimes when you're making some kind of package, whether it's a battery or something else, I'll just use the example of battery or battery pack. If you have everything you need except one thing, that one thing holds up the whole process. And, so we've seen how the reliance on China for so much equipment and so much processing has created a logjam. And that isn't even necessarily geopolitically related. A lot of it is related to the pandemic, which hit China the hardest, and you saw multiple waves of it. So, we think of, so I'm in the US and so is Luke. From our perspective, where we often say politically in the US, politicians say our greatest trading partner is Canada, our greatest ally is the UK. Even if we were to rely on those countries for much of or just the brunt of our energy transition technology, that's not really smart either. A diverse supply chain is what we need. It doesn't, even regardless of politics. And then the politics add another layer, and that can be a valid layer. And I'll let Luke touch on the environmental justice piece because I think he's more familiar with that.
Yeah. Um, the look, I think that when we think about how to undertake an equitable and sustainable transition to a new clean energy economy, there's been, I think, properly a lot of policy focus on what it means to really get real about climate justice and environmental justice outcomes, which I think is super important. The underpinnings of the environmental justice discussion are rooted in the recognition that certain frontline communities over time have borne a disproportionate burden of the fossil fuel economy for decades now. And with the opportunity to shift our energy systems away from fossil fuels towards something cleaner, there's an imperative to embrace the opportunity to invest in marginalized and frontline communities, to usher in all sorts of equity benefits. And so in New York, this was mandated into law by the CLCPA, the New York State Climate Law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in 2019. And the requirement is to flow 35% of the benefit of spending on clean energy programs to certain designated communities. And I think, California pursued a similar policy, and ultimately the Biden administration enshrined this in what they call the Justice 40 initiative. The overall federal target is a 40% benefit being directed to these communities overall. And when we think about it, I think the recognition on our part is that a lot of the discussion around clean energy and sustainability is focused on environmental integrity, and rightly so, but a much more proximate and sort of direct impact of these projects and the transition is on overall social health and welfare. I think in my mind, the reason why it's so important to do this work is to really sustain the life of all of our communities, in a way that is more beneficial. So yeah, I think it's very important underpinning of all of this is a focus on environmental justice.
Absolutely. And I was going to ask, like, when we say environmental justice and equity in regards to the energy transition and the application or sharing of those benefits at that 35% benchmark, like, what does that mean? Does that mean like making sure that 35% of the energy is going to these communities? Does that mean the jobs? Does that mean economic benefits associated with, like these projects and just the economy of, of this energy sector? Um, like when we say 35%, can we ground in like of what?
Yeah. So I think that that's exactly the right question. And I think that um, there's probably a different policy answer depending on the jurisdiction that you're working under. The way that we think about it is that clean energy projects deliver um, two types of meaningful benefits to anybody. On the one hand, you have a set of direct investments that the project makes, whether it's on, like actually developing a project, like buying equipment, commissioning labor, performing work. So there's direct investments. Then there are directly induced supply chain effects. So providing goods and services in support of that development and operating effort. And then there's community benefit type engagements where you make direct investments to community to advance co-benefits that might not be properly construed as a direct part of the project itself, but are important to advance in their own right for community benefits proper. So that's like the investment side. And then we think also on the other side about just the intrinsic benefits that these projects deliver in terms of air quality enhancements, reduced exposure to toxins, criteria air pollutants like NOx, SOx, and particulate matter, which are really the drivers of a lot of the negative health outcomes in our frontline communities, as well as climate change mitigation effects and electric, system resilience hardening impacts that these projects can also deliver. So you have investments and then you have intrinsic benefits. And I think taken collectively, what everybody should be thinking about is how those benefits how they materialize across communities and making sure to focus on that everything that we can do to include frontline community members and marginalized community groups should be undertaken.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to go back just for a moment to something that Lauren had been speaking about in regard to the energy and supply chain. And then I promise I will move us along because I know we have so much to talk about. But just like we talk about diversity and like diversity is always a good idea. And so much of those who listen to Sustain's podcast and interact with our platform and certainly see me talk across various exposures knows that I'm always talking about resilience. Like that is what I believe sustainability and ESG. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you fall on. Like this is about long-term resilience and having a sustainable plan in place. And so when you think of energy security and the supply chain, like, the crises that Lauren mentioned, whether it's, the Russian-Ukraine war and the constriction on natural gas and oil supplies, the idea of building resilience into your energy policy and your supply chain is a good idea. It's a good business idea. It's a good security idea. Yeah.
Oh, I would completely agree. And I would say that, it comes down to that word diversity that you mentioned. And diversity means you have fallback options. And the reason you need fallback options is because things happen, it seems like every single year that are unexpected. And so you need to be prepared for those. You need to rely on different countries. You need to rely on different technologies. And then, in terms of the environmental justice piece, you need to be treating employees right. You need to be treating communities right, because that will prevent a lot of the controversies and make things more resilient. And some of this is, preparing for the long term, keeping that long term perspective in mind, ensuring that there's layers of protection for the supply chain, for equipment, for energy, and then also just layers of respect because that will pay off in the long run when it comes to labor, when it comes to neighbors.
Absolutely. Okay, great. I'm going to move us along because I know that we have so much to cover. And I'm going to apologize because I may be sneezing. I'm apparently allergic to my home office today. So excuse those if I jump on mute for a moment. But just looking at, thinking about the energy transition, we've talked about the global perspective, but let's add like a little more specificity to what this looks like on a more regional scale. So when we look at the US, we have goals. We have a policy here, right? You go to the Biden-Harris administration webpage, you go to the White House, and these are our stated goals. What we want as a country, we are seeking carbon-free power sector by 2035. That's not so far from now, and net zero across all economies by 2050. I mean, these are really, really, really beefy, ambitious goals. Whenever I look at kind of the trajectory of our business as usual, and if all the policies were put in place, not to be cynical, but I think we have a long way to go to achieve these goals across the nation, and there are a lot of those challenges and levers to pull to be able to get there. But it's not just about net zero, right? Like so much of what we are talking about in the energy transition are I won't. They're not auxiliary because they are so much core part of this whole um, transition, but they are not necessarily the most literal kind of goal that you might think of. So things like we've been talking about around environmental justice, creating jobs in the clean energy sector, tying our community and then tying our economy and people's jobs, what they, tie their life to, they're supporting their lifestyle to this economy and revitalizing US manufacturing via the clean energy products. We have spent a lot of time and, thinking about things like the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the policies and tools that are in place here. So much of this is not just, okay, we need to transition to net zero, but what are all the different systems that need to connect to that to not just enable that to happen, but enable it to be a sustainable path moving forward and really shift this whole paradigm. I mean, it's so transformative what we are talking about, especially in the US. Like we are ingrained in a fossil fuel economy. And that is very much so the challenge is it's not just where are you procuring your energy, what are your energy sources, but it is the other impacts on your economy and the people within your country, whether that's their job or whether that's the clean air and water that they are able to breathe. So it's really foundational, Luke, like what you were saying with that environmental justice. The federal government has in my mind, and I think as seen here, they've really taken that to heart. Like that is a key underpinning. I actually hadn't realized that it looks like they stole a line out of the CLCPA and kind of took a note from New York that had started out with that as one of their primary goals. And so when we think of the challenges in the US, we are a large and diverse country. Um, I think the first thing people think of when they think of net zero is great. Let's electrify everything and get renewable sources. And, as we know, and Luke, I know you're going to dive into this, getting the renewable generation is one thing, but getting the transmission capacity to where that power is actually consumed is quite another. And in the US, this isn't specific to just transmission lines and energy. You have this in water and sewer and piping. We have old infrastructure. It is old. Our country has not been around as long as Europe, certainly, but we have an old and aging infrastructural system. And so it's very expensive to upgrade that or change that. And so there is really a shift needed to understand, how can we best approach this? I was like reading some stats around even the gas network and how, you know, gas leaks really important to address, right? You have methane leaks that happen from the distribution of gas. I'm based in New York, like these really awful building explosions that happen. There's a public safety and an urgent imperative to maintain the aging gas infrastructure. But it also means that we keep investing money into an aging system and a fossil fuel based system. And so it's this balancing of priorities. Lauren, you mentioned that idea of competing priorities of how do you keep the people safe, keep the power on, keep the heat going, but put policies and systems in place that are going to allow you to transition away from this legacy fossil fuel system towards a renewable and net zero energy infrastructure. Um, and I had been reading a really interesting report from RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute. And, again, this is really complicated. This is a big ship to steer, to turn around. We have federal policies, we have state policies and plans, we have more regional city and municipal policies. But you know, I think one of the challenges that we have is this is not just a technology problem. This is a policy problem. There are competing priorities of societal benefits and environmental benefits. And, I think one of the greatest things going back to environmental justice for us to keep our eye on the ball and make sure we are doing correctly from day one is making sure that we have the policy infrastructure and regulation in place to ensure that we are making transition to clean energy. Because at the end of the day, there are ratepayers to think about, right? You can't just put a bunch of expensive energy on the market. And, there are ratepayers that need to consume this. And so that's something we think of the global perspective. But this is a good time to pass it over to Luke. Can you talk a little bit about New York State? So what are the state's, clean energy goals, and what is the state's roadmap to get there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in light of all of the complexity that you just laid out, like, let's look at a relatively simple but still extraordinarily complicated case study of the state of New York. A super large economy, with a lot of people, best state in the union. And, in 2019, the governor passed the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which I talked about earlier a little bit. But really, in many people's mind, the cornerstone requirement of that law, certainly the first one to be very clear, was that there's a goal of 70% renewable energy through the electric system by 2030, and 100% emissions-free energy by 2040. Uh, and there is going to be other elements of the law that come forth, over time, because it seeks to regulate carbon emissions across the state's entire economy. But we start with the power sector. And, the thing that we focused in on, alongside the state, was that in order to deliver that level of penetration of renewable energy, there's uh, a fundamental imbalance of the New York state grid that needs to be addressed. So in New York, upstate, there's a lot of large scale hydropower and a lot of historic or early renewables projects that make it so that the upstate grid is already 90% emissions free today. Whereas in downstate New York, it was about 70%, 75% fossil fuel driven before they closed Indian Point. And after the closure of Indian Point, now the downstate grid is something on the order of 90 to 92% driven by fossil fuels. And so if you have that disconnect, how can you usher forth 70% renewable penetration across the state? Turns out you can't do it. So NYSERDA and the Department of Public Service worked with the Public Service Commission to release a program that would seek projects and fund them that could solve that grid imbalance. So if you go to the next slide, the big reveal is that we responded with a project called Clean Path New York. And we were fortunate enough to be designated as an awardee. The project is being advanced by a partnership comprised of Energy Re, which is who I am with, and Invenergy, which is the largest privately held developer of renewables in North America, and the New York Power Authority, which is an agency and authority that owns and operates a third of the state's bulk power system today. So together, we put forth a plan to build um, 3,800 megawatts of new wind and solar, so that we could have a huge amount of clean energy that we're generating all across the state. All of this is contained within the state of New York. And then when we deliver that power from around the state and upstate into New York City through a 178-mile, all underground HVDC transmission line. And this will be a huge project. It's the largest clean energy infrastructure project, we think, in the country. Um, it's roughly $11 billion of private investment to get this all done. It's about 2,000 megawatts of wind and 1,800 megawatts of solar, which is $7.5 billion worth of generation investment, coupled with $3.5 billion of transmission build out to bring that power downstate. Because it's all within New York State, we create 8,300 jobs, all of which are in the state. And we're ultimately going to wind up reducing the amount of fossil fuel fired generation to make electricity by 22% per year when we bring this project online. That'll result in 49 million tons of carbon emissions being avoided by 2040 when the state forecasts the grid is going to be 100% clean. And that's like taking 9 million cars off the road. And what I was talking about earlier with respect to climate justice, it's really a centerpiece of what we're trying to do here. The emissions that you avoid in cleaning up that large of a chunk of the grid delivers billions of dollars of avoided social and public health expenses, especially to frontline communities that need this relief the most. We think the project is great because it utilizes existing rights of way. It's all underground. You talked at length about the importance of energy independence, given recent geopolitical turmoil, and its impact on commodity price variability that is ultimately borne by ratepayers throughout the state. We think that our project is extraordinarily beneficial in insulating ratepayers from that market volatility. And then finally, the last thing I'll say about what we're trying to do is we're committed to deploying a $270 million community investment fund that will live for the life of the project, that will really allow us to engage directly with communities, to advance things like workforce development and really getting real about the just transition to clean energy. Think local hiring practices, apprenticeship programs, education at all levels, primary, secondary, and continuing ed programs for frontline community members and others, connecting these communities to STEM education opportunities. Another initiative around expanding access to healthcare in frontline communities. And then finally, an initiative around environmental conservation and stewardship. So I think the interesting thing about the story of New York is not only that there's a path-breaking vision around a policy ambition, but there's the leadership and, sort of can-do attitude to pursue projects like this that are really transformative and will have huge, meaningful impacts on communities all across the state.
Just give a round of applause. I mean, it's amazing. Like this project has so much magnitude in its scale. This is a really big deal for New York and also for the United States. This is the largest project in the country, you said, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's as far as we can tell. I would love somebody to
Challenge.
if they think I'm wrong, but like even looking back historically in terms of clean energy, I think it is among the largest, if not the largest.
Amazing. Okay, and I might have actually missed this, but when is the completion date for this? Like, is this a phase project? Is it all coming online in one fell swoop?
Yeah, so our anticipated go live date is 2027. So
Wow.
although that sounds maybe to some like it's far off, we have a large team of dedicated people who are basically working full time, overtime, and on weekends all the time trying to get this done. There's a lot to do, and we are all super excited to be doing.
That's so amazing. Amazing. Go ahead, Lauren. Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, in addition to projects like this, which are just hugely large scale and kind of, you mentioned leadership, and that's something that's really needed to get more transmission built. And, like we were talking about earlier, like you're talking about earlier, Alyssa, you can't just build renewables and then expect them to get somewhere without transmission. And we have this huge problem of permitting, both in the US and Europe and, other Western countries in particular. But there's this permitting logjam. And while we might have goals for increasing renewable energy, we need ways to connect that renewable energy, often which is in different places than where the fossil fuels are. We need more transmission capacity because of the additional capacity and because of the different locations. But a lot of governments are not set up for approving that in a timely manner that lines up with their goals. And in addition to projects like this, so there's maybe three solutions, projects like this. Another is, government permitting reform. And I want to give credit to the Energy Transitions Commission. Take a look at a recent report that they've done on permitting reforms, and they've mentioned a lot of success stories. Spain has done this, Denmark has done this. And if governments could combine some of these success stories and implement them, they can avoid a lot of wasted time. Well, a lot of the delays are due to, and a lot of the logjam is due to the process, which is very democratic and is very good, that makes room for litigation, that makes room for petitions against these projects, which is good. But there's ways to streamline that. There's ways to do that in a more efficient way that avoids wasting time, that makes these challenges known early on so that companies don't waste their time and go down roads that they shouldn't go down. Um, there's ways to streamline government permitting rather than having different agencies in charge of different things, which you're going to get different answers because there's different leaders of these different agencies. Have it be a one-stop shop. That way they can come up with some kind of compromise in one place. Sorry, there's a mute issue there that just popped up. But there's a lot of specific examples in that report about permitting reform. That's another area. A third is new technologies. And I want to just point the spotlight on companies like, there's one called VEIR, and they're looking at superconductors. And so they're in the advanced stages. They're being very modest about how much progress they've made, because they do have a few things left to do in the research projects, but they're very, very far along. And they would pack, assuming that everything works out, they would pack in about 5 to 10 times more power, and they would be able to use the same rights of way. So they would be able to add their transmission lines, perhaps under existing transmission lines, or replace them. So you don't have to worry about getting approval for new rights of way. You can just use the same ones, but have different technology that packs in more power. So these are things I think to watch.
Very cool.
Very cool.
Although I do think part of that I heard you say was something along the lines of make government agencies more efficient. So good, good luck on that one, because that is the challenge with any.
But it's happened before. But you're right. How do you do that? Because then there's people that are resistant to that, or they say, we don't want to be more efficient because then, people can't use their voice. So there's a balance there. And, and also different countries and different states are going to be different. But there is a lot of waste, and there's a lot of governments just sitting on their feet. So there's ways to cut some of that waste, maybe do, I don't know, halfway better, at least.
Good goal. All right. Well, I want to get to the portion where we really talk about some of the barriers across, some of these various industry verticals. So we've been talking a lot about the power sector, but, what is there anything that we haven't spoken about yet in terms of how the power sector impacts our progress towards clean energy? I think it's one of the more natural, like linear connections to clean energy is, well, how are you making your power? But, we've spoken a bit about the barrier of transmission and actually being able to accommodate these renewable sources that come online and get it from the place where it is generated to the places where it is consumed. What are some other barriers that we can leverage as opportunities in the power sector?
Well, look. I don't know if I'm gonna frame them up necessarily as barriers, but I think the place where, there are several places where we need to spend some time and focus. You know, the electrification of everything is sort of the undergirding strategy of how we get to carbon neutrality, right? So, um, it's recognized that now, oil and gas uses in commercial, residential buildings and industrial processes need to be vastly curtailed, and in some jurisdictions, eliminated according to the policy. So what do you replace those sources with? any manner of non-emitting fuel sources. So wind, solar, fuel cells, hydrogen, geothermal, thermal network exchanges, all the rest of it. But uh, the electrification of transportation is like another complicating factor. It will take some jurisdictions from being systems and grids that peak in the summer to systems and grids that peak in the winter. And what does that mean for a reliability perspective? Like, what is your fuel mix? What does your electricity source mix need to reasonably look like to maintain grid integrity? What does the transmission system build out need to look like in order to support long haul trucking, for example? There's a recent article I read that I think National Grid put out that talked about the charging facilities for long haul truckings being reasonable, like sort of on the order of a small town's worth of electricity capacity required to charge the vehicle. So how do we think about that? In terms of, and once you do that, the real question, in a lot of people's minds is, what do you do about heating, right? Like, we already do a lot of electric cooking. We already do a lot of electric cooling. We do lighting. We do ventilation. Most of that is already all electric. Um, how do we think about providing heat in cold climates via electricity? That's going to be a very difficult thing to sort out, which I think brings us to the question of buildings. And in my former life, I did a lot of work to, advance the energy performance of, buildings in New York. Uh, it's worth pausing, as we're doing this case study of New York, I guess, during this webinar. On the state side, we did a lot of discussion around how policies are giving rise to solutions on the supply side in terms of decarbonizing the electric sector. In New York City, around the same time that the state passed its climate law, the city passed another climate law called Local Law 97, which really tries to get after how to motivate building owners to reduce their carbon profile. So attacking the demand side of the equation rather than the supply side. And what I think a lot of people are observing is that it's going to take a lot of innovative strategies, a lot of difficult planning exercises. It's really going to have to be an all of the above solution to accommodating, the amount of carbon reduction that we need to observe in our built environment. I think I'll just pause there in recognition of the fact that there's only limited time in the webinar, and sort of kick it over to Lauren to talk about EVs and battery technology.
Well, in terms of barriers and levers, batteries are very important to watch. Uh, there is a lot of research on new battery chemistries because batteries only go so far, whether it is batteries that are in electric vehicles or batteries that are standalone to back up the grid, to back up renewables. And for example, a lot of them only last so far. They only have so much range. If you're talking about a vehicle, they have only so much time. If you're talking about a stationary one, and there's a lot of research underway on new battery chemistries, and I think that's really important to follow because there's limitations to our electrification. There's limitations to the build out of renewables. There's limitations to how clean electric vehicles can really be, depending on, whether we can rely a lot on renewables, whether there's proper storage. And, there's a lot of research underway on technologies where the batteries would be more energy dense and that's thus lighter weight. That'll be important for aviation that we can talk about later, for shipping. More energy dense batteries would allow longer ranges. it could allow for cheaper prices. It could allow for less dependence on precious minerals such as lithium and cobalt. So cobalt is really the big one, I think, in my view, because you can really get it from you can only really get it from a select group of countries, and the main one is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Here in the U.S., we don't have a free trade agreement with them. Lithium is another one we're very dependent on, uh, but we do have some lithium in the U.S. Other countries have lithium. Uh, from our U.S. perspective, we have some allies that produce a lot of lithium. We have free trade agreements with Australia and Chile, and they're two of the biggest producers. So that's less of an issue, but still, we need a lot of lithium for these batteries. And there are there's a lot of research going underway on batteries that would use different chemistries, that would use less of these precious minerals, and even this is a little further off, but ones that would use even more common elements such as sodium and sulfur, and less on these ones that you have to go out and find and mine someplace far away.
Right. Yeah. I think so often when, maybe I'll say so often at maybe the most superficial level, but you think of the energy transition, you're like, great, electrify everything and use renewables. But it's not as simple as that, right? If you're going to be using electricity, there's obviously the transmission problem, there's the storage problem. Go ahead, Lauren.
Go ahead, Lauren. Yeah, I mean, there's three problems with relying on electrification as a silver bullet, so to speak. I mean, like Liz said, there is an undergirding with electrification because it's eyed as the top tool for decarbonizing transportation. It's eyed as a top tool for decarbonizing industrial processes. You can use electricity instead of burning coal. You can use electricity instead of burning gas at oil and gas rigs at factories. So it's something that's going to be really important. Electrifying more of the economy, it'll be more efficient. It can be cleaner, um, but it can't be a silver bullet because of that potential over dependence on critical minerals needed for electrification, for storage. We talked about all that transmission needed, and also just the more capacity needed for infrastructure, charging infrastructure on the transportation side, transmission for the electric side, for flowing that electricity. And another issue is in some cases, electrification is not the best answer. So diversity is important here too. There are some industrial processes where hydrogen could be better than electrification. There are some situations where, let's say that you are producing lots of renewable energy and you want to export it to a country that doesn't have a lot of energy, a country that's energy poor. And hydrogen is more transportable and it stays there. So you can generate what's called clean or green hydrogen, and it'll stay there. It'll stay intact. You don't have to worry about a battery, which you have a few hours of life and then it kind of dissipates. And you pull up the slide, hydrogen, a versatile Swiss Army knife of energy. Hydrogen does have downsides, but it's getting so much attention. And when I went to COP27, everybody was talking about hydrogen in every single circle, from different sides of different debates, different stakeholders. And you'll notice this is from the Department of Energy. It's a really compelling graphic, although it's a little confusing, but you can see how on both sides, hydrogen can be generated in different ways. So on the far left, you see renewables, nuclear, fossil energy forms, and there's different categories beneath all of those, but it can be made in different ways. It can be used for storage. It can be used in the gas sector, and also it can be used in different applications. It can be used right now. It's used a lot in refining, and it could be used in other sectors such as metals. Steel, the steel industry is looking at it quite a bit. It can be used for vehicles, especially heavy duty vehicles or some of the long haul vehicles. It's gaining a lot of attention, and it can be used in heating. So it's just so flexible, both in terms of how it is produced on that side, but also how it can be used.
Really interesting. Yeah. I feel like when we included this little section on hydrogen because it's, I think, if you're going to have a conversation about the energy transition, you got to talk about hydrogen. It's kind of like this, not so new, but kind of new sexy kid on the block. There's all this kind of excitement about its potential and its application and, how it could be used for a scalable, form of energy. Do you mind just taking a moment, Lauren, to kind of educate the users? I think this graphic. Just on the
just
different
on the
color.
different color. Yes. Yes. So the colors are let's go with the main ones to start with. So currently today you have gray hydrogen. That is hydrogen that is produced using natural gas, and the natural gas typically involves emissions. So there's some emissions involved in this hydrogen. It's not totally clean, but that's the commonplace hydrogen that you have today, gray hydrogen. Um, you also have something called blue hydrogen, which would be produced again using natural gas, but you would capture the gas. That's what's called blue. And usually natural gas is associated with the color blue. So that's why they call it that. And green would be produced using renewable power. This would be more expensive. And our estimates of energy intelligence show that with economies of scale, it would take about 15 years for green hydrogen produced using renewables to reach cost parity with a gray or blue. But that depends on gas prices. It also depends on how different regions have different amounts of renewables, and some renewables can be produced more cheaply. So I'm thinking of places like the Middle East, they can produce a lot of cheap renewables. So they're at a real advantage. Pink hydrogen is produced using nuclear. So in a way, that's very similar to green hydrogen because it involves zero emissions there, and you don't need to abate it using carbon capture. There's also, many others. Blue or black hydrogen involves generating using coal, and there is a project underway in the Asia Pacific that would capture the coal emissions. So in a way, it's like blue hydrogen. If the emissions are captured, they're captured. And there's also, something called turquoise hydrogen that you would use a process called methane pyrolysis. There's something called, I think it's called yellow hydrogen that would use a different solar process. So that's kind of an overview, but it's a very complex color spectrum there.
Absolutely. And I think, again, going back to like just drawing a parallel to when we were talking about gas and like investing in, fixing your gas lines, but like you're still investing in gas. There's kind of this question across the different colors of hydrogen, where if you're investing in hydrogen production, but it's a fossil fuel based production, that's money that you are investing to still rely on fossil fuels, even if you're capturing the gases, just thinking about limited amount of investment dollars, to be invested, and then the life of these facilities that come online. And so, you know, I think diversity is our friend here, like we've been saying, right? You can't just, it's the having truly renewable based pink hydrogen, green hydrogen, really expensive, not feasible. Besides cost, are there other barriers or levers of what could help promote hydrogen to really be applicable at scale? Like what is holding that back right now, and what levers could we pull to kind of ease that on along the way? What work is needed?
I would say aside from cost, which is that big one, you already touched on that. That really makes a difference, and really cost. The answer is economies of scale and just experience, mainly. But another barrier is lopsided investments. We hear in a lot of different regions of the world that there's a lot of investments flowing in, or even just the planning, not even the actual FIDs, the final investment decisions. Although those are picking up, but there's a lot of interest in the hydrogen production side. But then you need off takers. So there's not as much interest in the demand side. That demand side needs to be developed. It needs to be cultivated. There needs to be interest drawn from potential users of hydrogen. But that is progressing. You're seeing from the steel industry, for example, a really keen interest in using hydrogen. So slowly and surely it's coming along. And to some extent, this is a chicken and egg issue. Industries want to make sure that hydrogen is going to be there before they even consider it. So you have a little bit of a timing challenge there. And there's also an issue of a lot of investment in production, but not as much in infrastructure. And there's a little bit of lopsidedness there. And again, chicken and egg issue, but that can be helped or ameliorated by governments and some strategic planning. And I know in the US, after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a lot of incentives for hydrogen, but now they're taking the issuance of those incentives, for example, and trying to plan where they put the money into a way that creates hydrogen hubs so that these pieces can work together. That production uh, to consumption and the infrastructure involved can kind of work together. So a little bit of advanced planning there, I think, will be important.
And so with that, I kind of want to tie it back to a last question in that, I think we've kind of we've given airtime and acknowledged a lot of the different players in the energy transition. You've got the producers and the project developers. You have the policy and governments, that are creating all the policies and regulations and programs. You have the consumers to consider, different stakeholders, communities. What we haven't really talked about is the historic, producer of energy and power, which is oil and gas. And so, Lauren, I think these next series of questions are maybe for you, but what role does oil and gas have in the energy transition? Is it a role? Is that
I would say huge in my view. And there's two reasons. One is expertise. And if you think about it, if you are an engineer that is involved in the oil and gas industry, you're employed by an oil and gas company, and you want to get involved in a new field, such as direct air capture, such as clean hydrogen, you're going to have a little bit of learning curve, but not that much. So for example, I'm a writer. That's not my skill set. I've not taken engineering classes. I've just taken some math, maybe calculus. But I don't have an engineer's brain. I have a creative person's brain. Don't have any engineering knowledge. So you could bring an oil and gas engineer or an engineer at a refinery up to speed on these new technologies within a matter of weeks or months. So you can use these pieces of expertise within the oil and gas industry, and they can catch up quickly and they can get involved quickly. So the oil and gas companies can bring a lot of expertise. It's a natural transition. If they invest in new technologies, in emerging technologies, they can bring a lot of expertise to the table. It'll take less time for them to catch up. Their learning curve is less. Secondly, is financial muscle. If you look at this graphic here, it might be a little tiny, but if you look at just at the top one, this is from our research, our low carbon investment tracker that our research team at Energy Intelligence puts together. It only looks at the top oil and gas companies, big ones like BP, Shell, Exxon, and then also national oil companies like Saudi Aramco. But among the top investments, there's huge ones in the billions. And so Exxon, for example, made a huge investment last year in blue hydrogen. And so oil and gas companies are already big players. They're putting down lots and lots of financial muscle. Arguably, they could be doing even more, and they are qualified to do even more. But they are already big players in terms of financial muscle. I also want to talk about a company that isn't really mentioned here in this graphic, but Occidental Petroleum in California is really being looked to by people from even environmental activists are pointing to them as an example because they're transitioning their business model to focus a lot on direct air capture and similar carbon renewable technologies. So from their perspective, they want to be ready for a future in which oil and gas isn't really popular anymore or, is even phased out through things like combustion engine bans, vehicle combustion engine bans. So I think in the future, what does the oil and gas industry look like? It's going to be very diverse. You might have companies like Oxy that focus on direct air capture. You could have ones that focus on something else, such as e-fuels, which can be made carbon neutral. You could have companies that transition to focus more on hydrogen, which plays to their skill sets. Oil and gas companies already use hydrogen in refining products, and it's a type of clean gas, which they're already very familiar with. You could also see oil and gas companies take the big tobacco route. If you think of just accepting the fact that oil and gas is their main product, that's their core product, and if people use it less, then the business just dwindles. And we don't have necessarily a house view on which is better, but I think it's going to look very diverse. I think there's a lot of routes that oil and gas companies can take, but clearly it's on their radar and they're taking steps in some direction or another.
Great. Okay. Well, I did not make good on my promise to hold questions until the end, but that was so much information. We're right at the top of the hour and respectful of everyone's time. I just want to thank you, Lauren and Luke, for joining us. Really interesting conversation, incredible highlights and insights to share. Thank you so much for joining us and to all of those on the line. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.